being dragged into war over WMDs, to fighting in a city rigged with booby traps, to finding Saddam Hussein hiding in a ditch and watching his statue come crashing down. This is the Iraq War Explained. A war that cost over 4,400 American lives, $2 trillion, and 8 long years we'll never get back. And when it was finally over, one question still lingered. Why did we fight this war in the first place, and was it ever worth it? But in order to find out, we gotta go back. Because this conflict didn't creep up on America. It crashed through the front door. Starting on September 11, 2001, when the United States experienced the deadliest terrorist attack in its history. Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 commercial airplanes, crashing 2 into the World Trade Center, 1 into the Pentagon, and 1 into a field in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back. Nearly 3,000 Americans died that morning. And in the blink of an eye, America went from peacetime to wartime. Because President George W. Bush stood on the rubble of Ground Zero with a bullhorn and told the world America would fight back. And almost immediately, the US invaded Afghanistan to go after Osama bin Laden and the Taliban, who gave Al-Qaeda a safe haven. But here's the thing. The Bush administration wasn't just looking at Afghanistan. They were already eyeing another target, Iraq. Because over in the Middle East sat a dictator who'd been a thorn in America's side for over a decade, Saddam Hussein. A ruthless strongman who ruled Iraq with an iron fist. He'd gassed his own people, killing thousands. He'd invaded Kuwait in 1990, which led to the Gulf War. And ever since, the US has kept him on a tight leash, with no-fly zones, UN sanctions, and weapons inspectors. But after 9/11, the Bush administration became convinced that Saddam posed a direct threat to the United States. The argument was 3 big claims. Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, maybe even nuclear. He had ties to Al-Qaeda and could hand those weapons to terrorists. And he was a danger not just to the Middle East, but to the entire world. So in his 2002 State of the Union, Bush labeled Iraq part of an axis of evil, alongside Iran and North Korea. And just like that, the drums of war started beating. Because the Bush administration, led by Vice President Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and Deputy Secretary Paul Wolfowitz, pushed hard for an invasion. And they weren't the only ones beating the war drum. Because in September 2002, former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu testified before Congress and told lawmakers there was no question whatsoever that Saddam was pursuing nuclear weapons. He urged the US to invade, promising that removing Saddam would have enormous positive reverberations on the region. Spoiler alert, it didn't. And 5 months later, Secretary of State Colin Powell went before the United Nations holding up a vial of fake anthrax, showing satellite photos of alleged weapons facilities and making the case that Saddam had to be stopped. It was a dramatic performance to say the least. But there was just one problem. A lot of the intelligence was either flawed or flat out wrong. Meanwhile, countries like France and Germany said, "Hold on, let the inspectors do their job." And the world staged the largest anti-war protest in human history. We're talking 6 to 10 million people marching across 800 cities on a single day. But Bush wasn't waiting around. Instead, he went on national television and gave Saddam Hussein an ultimatum. Leave Iraq in 48 hours or face the consequences. Saddam didn't budge, and 3 days later, America went to war. Because on March 20th, 2003, the US military launched Operation Iraqi Freedom with a campaign the Pentagon called Shock and Awe. And they were not kidding with that name. Because the night sky over Baghdad lit up like the 4th of July. Except instead of fireworks, it was Tomahawk cruise missiles and precision-guided bombs raining down on government buildings, military bases, and command centers. Hit Iraq so hard and so fast, Saddam's regime would crumble before it could even fight back. And honestly, the invasion itself was a military masterclass. Because a combined force of about 177,000 US and British troops blitzed across the desert toward Baghdad. Iraqi forces put up a scattered resistance, but they were outmatched in every way. And the 3rd Infantry Division made a legendary Thunder Run, charging armored columns straight through the streets of Baghdad to prove the capital could be taken. Just 3 weeks after the invasion began, US Marines rolled into the heart of Baghdad, where Iraqi civilians, with the help of American troops, pulled down a massive statue of Saddam Hussein. The image was beamed around the world, and for a moment, it looked like the war was already won. President Bush even landed on the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln, stood beneath a giant banner that read "Mission Accomplished," and declared that major combat operations in Iraq were over. Woohoo! Great job, boys! Let's pack it up and go home. But then, everything fell apart. Because the US had a pretty solid plan for winning the war. But for what came after, not so much. The man in charge of rebuilding Iraq was Paul Bremer, head of the Coalition Provisional Authority. And within his first 2 weeks on the job, Bremer made two decisions that many historians consider the most disastrous of the entire war. Order number 1 was de-Baathification, which banned all members of Saddam's Ba'ath Party from government jobs. This sounds pretty reasonable, right? Except the Ba'ath Party ran everything in Iraq. Teachers, doctors, and engineers were gone overnight, and about 100,000 Iraqis were suddenly out of work. Order number 2 was dissolving the entire Iraqi military. Hundreds of thousands of trained soldiers, many of them with weapons, were sent home with no jobs, no pay, and no future. Translation: we just created an army of angry, armed, unemployed men with military training. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Everything went wrong. 'Cause almost overnight, an insurgency exploded across Iraq. Former soldiers, Ba'athists, Sunni militants, and foreign jihadists all found common ground. They wanted the Americans out. So roadside bombs called IEDs became the insurgents' weapon of choice. They were cheap, easy to hide, and absolutely devastating. Meanwhile, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, a Jordanian jihadist, emerged as the face of terror in Iraq. He led al-Qaeda in Iraq, orchestrating car bombings, kidnappings, and brutal beheadings that were filmed and broadcast to the world. This guy was pure evil. And in August 2003, a massive truck bomb hit the UN headquarters in Baghdad, killing 22 people, including the UN's top envoy. The message was clear: nobody is safe. And then came the scandal that shattered whatever moral high ground America still had. 'Cause in April 2004, photos leaked showing American soldiers abusing and humiliating Iraqi prisoners at Abu Ghraib prison. The images were horrifying, and they spread across the globe like wildfire. For millions of people, Abu Ghraib became the symbol of everything that had gone wrong. It radicalized Iraqis, fueled recruitment for the insurgency, and damaged America's reputation in ways that would take years to repair. Man, that was brutal. But it was about to get a whole lot rougher. 'Cause 2004 brought the bloodiest urban battle of the entire war: the battles of Fallujah. It started in 2004 when insurgents in the city of Fallujah ambushed and killed 4 American private military contractors from Blackwater. Their bodies were burned, dragged through the streets, and hung from a bridge over the Euphrates River. The images shocked America, and the Marines were ordered to take the city back. But the first battle of Fallujah stalled. After heavy civilian casualties, the Marines were ordered to stop the assault. So the CIA assembled a makeshift Iraqi security force called the Fallujah Brigade. The idea was simple: hand security over to local Iraqis and pull American troops out of the city. But guess what happened? The brigade collapsed within months, and its members joined the insurgency. And Fallujah became the most heavily fortified insurgent stronghold in all of Iraq. Sir, I think that backfired. So in November 2004, the Marines came back, and this time, they weren't leaving. 'Cause the second Battle of Fallujah, codenamed Operation Phantom Fury, was the fiercest urban combat US forces had seen since Vietnam. Most of Fallujah's 300,000 civilians had fled, and what was left was a city rigged with booby traps, sniper nests, and thousands of entrenched fighters. Marines and soldiers fought block by block, house by house. They blew holes through walls rather than risk booby trap doors. Snipers lurked on every rooftop, and at night, the glow of burning buildings turned the skyline orange. And after 6 weeks of relentless combat, the city was secured. But the cost was staggering, 'cause more than 95 American troops were killed and over 560 wounded. An estimated 1,200 insurgents were killed. And by the time it was over, more than 40% of the city lay in ruins. The insurgents in Fallujah were largely destroyed, but the violence didn't stop. It just moved somewhere else. 'Cause here's the nightmare nobody planned for. Iraq wasn't just fighting the Americans, it was fighting itself. The country was split along ancient fault lines. The Shia majority, long oppressed under Saddam, the Sunni minority who'd held power, and the Kurds in the north. And when Saddam fell, it was like pulling the pin on a grenade. Al-Zarqawi's strategy was diabolical. He deliberately targeted Shia civilians and holy sites to provoke a civil war. And in 2006, his operatives bombed the Al-Askari Mosque, one of the holiest Shia shrines in the world, blowing its iconic golden dome to pieces. And just like that, Iraq broke itself in half. 'Cause Shia militias unleashed waves of retaliatory violence against Sunni neighborhoods. Death squads roamed Baghdad, and bodies turned up every morning in the streets. either dumped in alleys or floating in the Tigris River. But at least one piece of good news came in 2006, when a US airstrike finally killed Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the mastermind behind so many of Iraq's worst atrocities. Good riddance! But even with Zarqawi gone, the civil war raged on. Cause by 2006, the United Nations reported that more than 34,000 Iraqi civilians were killed in a single year. Baghdad was a war zone. Neighborhoods were ethnically cleansed in weeks, and American troops were caught in the middle of a full-blown civil war they weren't equipped to stop. Oh, and back home, the news just kept getting worse. Cause remember those WMDs everyone warned about? Well, they didn't exist. Inspectors confirmed Iraq had no stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction. The entire stated reason for the Iraq War was based on bad intelligence. Are you kidding me, sir? As you can imagine, public support for the war was cratering. In November 2006, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, one of the main architects of the invasion, resigned. Iraq was spiraling, and America faced an impossible choice. Pull out and risk Iraq collapsing into total chaos. Stay the course with a strategy that clearly wasn't working, or try something completely different. So in January 2007, President Bush went on national television and announced the most controversial decision of his presidency. He was sending more than 20,000 additional troops into Iraq, not to pull back, not to hand things off, but to surge into the violence and take the fight directly into Baghdad's deadliest neighborhoods. Most people thought he was crazy. Congress was furious. The public was exhausted, and critics said he was throwing good lives after bad. But Bush had an ace up his sleeve, a new commander, General David Petraeus, a Princeton PhD who literally wrote the book on counterinsurgency, the U.S. Army's Counterinsurgency Field Manual. And his philosophy was radically different from everything the U.S. had been doing. Instead of hunkering down on giant bases and only going out to chase bad guys, Petraeus moved American troops into Iraqi neighborhoods, living alongside the people they were supposed to protect. The idea was simple but risky. You can't protect people from behind a fortress wall. You have to be where they are. It was the total opposite of everything the military had been doing. Before the surge, U.S. troops would clear neighborhoods of insurgents and then leave. And every time they left, the bad guys came right back in. It was like mopping a floor while the faucet was still running. But Petraeus flipped the script. Troops would clear a neighborhood, hold it, and then build, working with locals to restore services, create jobs, and build trust. It was dangerous, because casualties spiked at first. 2007 became the deadliest year of the war for American troops, with over 900 killed. The price of getting closer to the fight was paid in blood. But slowly, it started working. Because Petraeus didn't just bring more soldiers, he brought a completely new mindset. But that's when fate dropped a plot twist so crazy, Miss Flappy thought I was literally making this up. I'm not, honey, I swear! Cause the US military's most unlikely ally turned out to be the people who'd been shooting at them this entire time. In Anbar province, the heartland of the Sunni insurgency, tribal leaders had grown sick and tired of Al-Qaeda. Zarqawi's men had terrorized their communities, killed their sheiks, and blown up anyone who disagreed. So, starting in late 2006, Sunni tribal leaders began reaching out to the Americans. They wanted to fight Al-Qaeda together. This movement became known as the Anbar Awakening, or the Sons of Iraq, and it changed everything. Cause former insurgents, the guys who've been planting IEDs against American patrols, were now standing shoulder to shoulder with US Marines. In other words, the enemy of my enemy is my new buddy. And Petraeus saw the potential immediately and poured resources into supporting the awakening across the country. Combined with the troop surge and the new counterinsurgency strategy, the results were dramatic. Attacks in Anbar province dropped from 1,350 per month to around 200. Across Iraq, violence plummeted. Civilian deaths dropped sharply. Sectarian killings in Baghdad fell by over half. Meanwhile, Shia cleric Muqtada al-Sadr ordered his Mahdi army to stand down, further reducing the bloodshed. By September 2007, Petraeus went before Congress and reported that the military objectives of the surge were being met, and he recommended a gradual drawdown of forces. The war had slowly and painfully turned around. But before we get to the withdrawal, there's one thread we need to tie up. Cause remember Saddam Hussein? After Baghdad fell, the dictator vanished. For months, the most wanted man in the world was a ghost. Until December 13, 2003, when U.S. Special Forces found him hiding in a spider hole, a tiny underground ditch near his hometown. The once mighty dictator was pulled from the dirt, disheveled and bearded, blinking into the flashlights of the soldiers who captured him. Yep, the man who ruled Iraq for 24 years was hiding in a hole in the ground. He was put on trial by an Iraqi court, found guilty of crimes against humanity, and executed by hanging in 2006. And by 2008, the situation in Iraq had stabilized enough for President Bush to sign a status of forces agreement with the Iraqi government. And when President Barack Obama took office, he inherited a war that was winding down and a timeline to bring the troops home. In 2010, Obama announced the end of U.S. combat operations in Iraq. And in 2011, the last American convoy rolled across the border into Kuwait. After nearly 9 years, the Iraq War was officially over. But honestly, it didn't feel like a victory parade. There was no surrender ceremony, no banner. They learned their lesson on that one. Just a quiet flag-lowering ceremony in Baghdad, and a long drive home. But in the end, the Iraq War didn't just change Iraq, it changed America and the world. Cause the war was launched on the claim that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, but he didn't. And that intelligence failure shook public trust in government institutions in ways that still echo today. And by the time the Iraq War was over, more than 4,400 Americans had given their lives. Over 32,000 were wounded. And the Iraqi death toll is estimated at nearly 100,000 civilians killed during the conflict, which is just devastating to think about. The war cost the U.S. an estimated $2 trillion. It destabilized an entire region, contributed to the rise of ISIS just a few years later, and left Iraq scarred by years of sectarian violence. But through it all, from the deserts of the initial invasion, to the streets of Fallujah, to the neighborhoods of Baghdad, American service members showed extraordinary courage under impossible circumstances. And regardless of how anyone feels about the decision to go to war, the men and women who served deserve our respect. God bless those who served, man. Every single one of them. But speaking of brave troops who plunged themselves in battle, this is the American Revolution explained. From barefoot farmers taking on the most powerful army on Earth, to a midnight crossing of the Delaware River that changed the course of history.